Well, greetings everybody. It's really very nice to be back with the Victorian group once more. As Michael shared my news, it's been quite a week for me. My father died on Sunday, but I know he would have wanted me to continue with my talks this week, and he was a great talker himself. He would often give talks, and so I'm just sort of following in his footsteps. It's a great delight on Thanksgiving to be talking about a subject that has really been something that I've been interested in for about 40 years now, because as many of you may know, I in normal years spend some of my year in the United States of America. And this is where I've accumulated quite a collection of photographs in many of the galleries throughout America and North USA and Canada. And so it's a delight really just to talk a little bit about, I talked about art and as it is in Britain and in Europe, but we're going to now look at the emerging distinctive voice of American art in really the late 19th century. But as with all of these frames, I have to move back a bit just to explain a little bit about the development of American painting as a distinct styles and schools. Of course, like anything, there are some very diverse artists, and it's such a huge subject. So I'm going to touch upon various schools and types of art that particularly have been seen as important. Forgive me if I omit your favorite artist or your favorite artwork. It's just impossible in a subject like this to cover it all in one lecture. But I'd hope to share with you some of the interesting artists and some of the thoughts that go behind some of the seminal paintings of American art from the mid-1850s. So we begin, and I'm going to begin with a president of the Royal Academy back here in London, the American Benjamin West. And now he was following in as president of the Royal Academy, following the precepts of Sir Joshua Reynolds, that is to bring to create an academy worthy of such in London, and he becomes the president of the Royal Academy at the same time that the Elgin marbles arrive in London. And we have a little painting there by Archibald Archer of the temporary Elgin Room. We know the enormous influence of the arrival of the classical sculptures from Greece had upon the world of architecture in Britain and naturally into fine art painting. And so most of all the early artists post the establishment of American independence studied in Europe, and so paintings of the founding fathers of the United States of America are mostly painted by European artists. For instance, look at Gilbert Stuart's painting of George Washington. And if you go to the Smithsonian in Washington, you'll find many of the founding fathers' portraits indeed painted by European artists or Americans who have gone to Europe to study. Benjamin West went to and fro between the USA and Europe, and particularly London. But homegrown artists didn't really start to emerge until when we look at the Hudson River School. But certainly Benjamin West was a very important character in British art of the early 19th century, and if you are interested, he would be somebody I would suggest is worth investigating. Mainly his main subjects are from the classical world and the biblical stories, which he paints in a grand manner, in a grand style, influenced of course by the great Sir Joshua Reynolds. So he was an artist of vision, but really an artist who, shall we say, brings out the first distinct American voice is in fact an artist who was born near Bolton in Lancashire in 1801, and it is the great Thomas Cole, one of the founding members of what is known as the Hudson River School in the eastern USA. Now, the Cole family emigrated to the USA. Thomas Cole's father was unsuccessful in business in many ways, and he went through a number of jobs. But his son showed quite a great degree of talent, and was apprenticed to an engraver when he came to the New York State. He had an interesting background, had young Thomas Cole. He, being in the northern city of Bolton, or just outside Manchester, he had witnessed some of the Luddites destroying cotton factory machinery, and these social concerns he took with him to the New World. And Thomas Cole too was fascinated by the art of the Romantic art, particularly of J.M.W. Turner. And he showed a great interest as an apprenticed engraver, and he came across a lot of Turner's work, and this was highly influential upon his own work. Thomas Cole returned to the United Kingdom, where he actually met with Turner, and also he also got on quite well with John Constable. And in fact, he had something of a friendship with John Constable. Perhaps you remember a few weeks ago, I spoke about John Constable, the great British landscape painter. And he got on rather better with John Constable, although his style, being influenced by the sublime, was far more influenced by Turner, really, than it was Constable. Now, Thomas Cole's work was not only depictions of the landscape around the Hudson River, which we're going to have a look at in a little while, but it also was these great romantic series of paintings. And one particular series, The Course of Empire, which is a 5-part series, charts the emergence of culture and empire to its ultimate destruction and desolation. And these thoughts are very similar to the British artist John Martin. And he was, in his grand compositions of The Course of Empire, he is influenced by a lot of classical sculpture, particularly this Borghese Gladiator is emphasized here. So this is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you can see in The Course of Empire the scene of destruction. And the same mountain or promontory in the middle part of the painting appears in all the paintings. So you can follow through this series of The Course of Empire. And these were in the thoughts. And Thomas Cole's an interesting figure too, because he's actually very interested in the idea of the new world, and is it going to go the way that the old world of Europe and the troubles that have arisen through the Industrial Revolution? Is it going to despoil nature in the same way as he had witnessed in the landscape around his home in Bolton and Manchester? So anyway, Thomas Cole goes back to the USA, and he paints part of the Hudson River. Now, the Hudson River, as we know, is on the eastern side of Manhattan Island, and it goes up into the mountains, into the Catskill Mountains, and he follows this river, and he paints plein air paintings in sketches in the Hudson River area, and many artists are beginning to become very interested in going outdoors and painting the beautiful scenery, the majestic scenery of the Hudson River. But this is the period, the Romantic period too. So there's always this, the idea within nature is embodied some of the great themes of art. And an instance of this is in his painting Titan's Goblet. So he's bringing about the abundance of nature and emphasizing a classical theme, even though he is looking to the world that he sees in the Hudson River, landscapes of the Hudson River. And so he's very much looking in a way, speaking, letting landscape speak, much as John Constable did in some of his later works. For instance, the painting Hadley Castle, which speaks of his own grief at the loss of his wife. So certainly Thomas Cole is an artist of a great importance, and the first really serious painter, homegrown painter in a way, because he develops his style within the United States of America, and he's of course not he is not formally trained in quite the way that a lot of the other artists were who had trained in Paris or London. His training is partly self-taught as well, but he is a quick learner and he has great skill, and we can detect a lot of his influences within his painting. So I move on and I show you the course of empire in the top left-hand corner, desolation. And you can see the direct parallel. He saw the painting Hadley Castle by John Constable, and in the desolation, the final, there is a column from a temple of a former civilization. And the course of empire is a series of 5 paintings, which is really a warning about what can happen. And so Thomas Cole takes with him the idea that the seeds of in the new world could eventually form something of a sort of an apocalypse that could bring about the destruction of society, and once again nature would rule supreme, and these ruins would emerge from the forests of the Catskill Mountains. He was very interested in Turner's work, and perhaps one may say he was rather disappointed when he actually met Turner, who's articulate in painting, and of course his paintings are the great paintings of the early 19th century and dying in 1851. But Turner was not verbally very articulate, and so this rather disappointed Thomas Cole on meeting him. And he found it very hard to reconcile the Turner who had painted such great paintings as Ulysses deriding Polyphemus with the man that he met. He just thought he was a rough and difficult and taciturn. Whereas his meeting with John Constable was very, very happy in a way. He was one of the few artists who really got on very well with John Constable. And we can see Constable's influence in Thomas Cole's work. And now this is a magnificent painting. This is known as the Oxbow, which is really a tremendously important painting in American art, really. And it depicts the Oxbow at Northampton in Massachusetts. And it was painted in 1836, shortly after he had returned to the United States of America. Now, the artist Thomas Cole can actually be seen. He's very small. If you notice, there's a little umbrella on the promontory above the river, and if you just go a couple of inches down from there, you can see the Thomas Cole painting from nature. One side of the landscape is in bright sunlight, the other side is in storm, and it is almost like a prophetic warning. And I'm going to point this out because certainly Thomas Cole was very much an artist who was using landscape and allegory to say something about human concerns. So it wasn't just like an impressionist painting of or topographic painting of the Oxbow, although, as you can see from my photograph at the bottom, where I've done a diagram of the Oxbow as it is today, he is in fact using the Oxbow, and if you notice the shape, the way that the Hudson River turns here, it forms a question mark. And that's meant to be very, very deliberate. I also want you to notice the mountain in the distance as well. So we're looking from Mount Holyoke across and the thunderstorm. the painting is very much akin to the John Constable sketches of meteorological conditions that I talked about a few weeks ago, and we can also see the broken branches of the sumac trees, and painting in these wooded hills above the Hudson River may have been pretty uncomfortable. Terrible mosquitoes and a lot of difficult things for the plein air artist. But Thomas Cole was very original, because a lot of artists then, although the final painting would have been a studio creation, certainly the sketches for it were done out of doors, and we commend him for that. I've pointed out that you would have also known this painting of the Deluge by John Martin, who was very influenced by the sublime. And so, if you notice in my little slide on the top right hand, and this is the mountain in the Oxbow, if we notice there, we can see the Hebrew letters on the mountain, and they spell the word Noah in Hebrew. So the painting, the Oxbow, is a warning to the world, rather like the warning in Genesis, that destruction was coming. And certainly this is very much upon Thomas Cole's mind, and the theme of the deluge and the great flood, the biblical flood, was one that obsessed artists in the late 1830s and 1840s. And there's another one of his in the top left-hand slide there, the course of empire, the consummation of empire. And people have pointed out that actually the procession across the bridge in this fine painting here, part of the series, was very similar. The emperor looked very similar to William IV and the coronation of William IV from the 8th of September 1831. So there are these elements within Cole's painting. There's also some other interesting elements within this painting that if this were just to talk about Thomas Cole, I would go into, but I might want to recommend to you Tim Barringer of the Paul Mellon Centre, who gives an excellent lecture on Thomas Cole on YouTube. And if you're interested in Thomas Cole, I would certainly suggest that you look Tim Barringer up, who is an expert on 19th century art, and is a very, very entertaining speaker and very, very knowledgeable. And he talks about this series, The Course of Empire. But a very significant group of paintings in the development of American art. So who were the other artists of the Hudson River School? Well, another very important artist was Albert Bierstadt. Now, Albert Bierstadt paints landscapes, sublime landscapes, again with this majestic views high above the River Hudson. The Hudson was opening out. There were steamers going up and down by the mid 19th century. And many, there was the West Point, of course, the military academy. Poughkeepsie was one of the places where a lot of people would go up the Hudson, and they would have these great days out in these wonderful river steamers, and there's some lovely pictures of those things. But the artists were really also paintings for the emerging middle class within the United States of America, who were building fine mansions in upstate New York and needed paintings for their walls. And so a lot of the Hudson River School paintings found their way onto some of the walls of the homes that were emerging there. But it is a distinct landscape that they are so engaged with. And there's another painting by Rossiter, who is another painter of this period. An artist who came from Reading, or family of artists who came from Reading, was the Havill family, and Robert Havill was involved. He was a master printmaker, and he was involved with James Audubon's engravings of the birds of North America. And this is a very important series of works, life-size engravings of the birds of North America. and Havill, whose family had come from Berkshire and Reading, and that's a painting of Caversham Bridge near Reading by William Havill. But Robert Havill came out to the USA, and he became an important artist in the Hudson River School, and that's a lovely painting by him, looking north to Croton Point. Bierstadt's paintings are also very important, as I pointed out, and this particular one, the discovery of the Hudson, was also very important. We often find that American art of this period likes to tell the story, the unique story of the emergence of a distinct new world. And so this is the happy meeting of the settlers with the indigenous peoples. Whether it is actually true is another matter, and that's a matter of conjecture. But of course, in the early years, the peoples of what is now Massachusetts and Connecticut did, and New York, upstate New York, were very much helped by the indigenous peoples at this time. And so there is the rainbow sign, again, the great promise of God's covenant with Noah, and so we're also linking that in with the Thomas Cole painting as well. And so these artists, although they weren't like the pre-Raphaelites, they didn't actually go out and paint together. They were covering a much greater area of landscape than indeed some of their European counterparts. They certainly, when they exhibited together, they exchanged ideas. And we had there's a Bierstadt one of an approaching thunderstorm, and you can see an echo in that particular painting of Thomas Cole's Oxbow in some ways, or it's almost a reverse of that in one sense. And here we have really a phenomenally important painting in the development of this unique voice of American painting. And this can be found in the New York Central Library. I saw this many years ago, and it is a very well-known painting. It is by Durand, who was an important artist. I wouldn't say he was as highly skilled an artist as Thomas Cole, but Asher Brown Durand was an important artist of this period. Thomas Cole, when Thomas Cole died, he sort of took up the mantle and took on that mission. And so this painting here depicts Thomas Cole and Cullen Bryant on this rocky promontory in the Catskills. And there we see Thomas Cole pointing with his mahl stick out into the wilderness. And this is something that occurs in American painting, is this high vantage point, and it's always looking out to the distance. And later on, we also have this idea of this constant idea of moving forward, and the idea of manifest destiny, which starts to occur within both literature and within painting. And now the painting is unlike the Thomas Cole painting in that it is a sort of an amalgamation of a number of views. So it isn't actually a one specific view, but the artist has built it up of a number of sketches. So there isn't actually this view in the Catskill Mountains, but it's made up of various rocky outcrops and a series of drawings. So it's possibly quite a studio creation. But it does echo the great romantic painting by Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer Over the Sea of Fog, and possibly also prefigures in some ways that famous painting by Millet of Ruskin standing upon a rocky promontory in Scotland. So there is this going on, and it's a fine painting anyway, and it's a very, very important painting to so many Americans. It talks about the beauty of the wilderness and what was to eventually become some part of their national parks, and these places are protected and revered. And particularly in upstate New York, there's this beautiful landscape, which I can attest to is a dramatic and beautiful and worth preserving, and the artists realize that, and they open this up to so many people. The title Kindred Spirits is taken from John Keats's sonnet to Solitude. And it was at this time too that the well-known writer Henry David Thoreau spent his year at Walden Pond. And Thoreau's writings are very allied in a way to what was going on in painting. And although he didn't have as direct an influence upon painting as, shall we say, John Ruskin did in Europe, Thoreau's engagement with the natural world and his philosophy certainly did have an enormous impact upon art. And so his writing about the Walden Pond is seen as very, very important, and his observations upon nature made whilst living in this little cabin on the Walden Pond near Concord, just north of Boston, is also seen as highly significant. And the great art historian Robert Hughes, the Australian art historian, said, "Landscape is to American painting what sex and psychoanalysis are to the American novel." And it's absolutely true. Landscape is intrinsic to our understanding of American art, and it really when we will see in the coming slides that this is just so fundamental to our if we're looking at American art, that landscape and man's relationship with this new world and this almost claiming the ground is very, very important to Americans in the formation of their identity. Of course, the Walden Pond itself is a point of pilgrimage now. It's rather strange, though. I found it that the railway line runs right at the end of it, and it's hardly a wilderness. It's really almost it's not that far away from Concord too. So it's an interesting place. But Concord's a very good place to visit if you want to engage with the work of Thoreau and also the writers like Emerson. It's an important place to examine and study. And at this time too, some very great technical developments were taking place in art. And we have an American, John Rand, to thank for the collapsible oil painting tube. And I think I've mentioned this in my talk about French Impressionism before. But he actually was the one who developed the sort of toothpaste tube of oil paint, which enabled artists like Thomas Cole to go outside and paint from the landscape. And the painters of the Hudson River School were very much in debt to John Rand, who was a portrait painter himself, not a particularly distinguished one, if I may say, but he was a competent painter. But we are all indebted to Rand that we now have tubes of paint rather than these rather inconvenient bladders of paint and having to mix up paint with pigments and linseed oil on the slab in the studio. And so America too was developing academies, and we thank Ashby Durand and Samuel Morse. The Morse of Morse code was in fact was an American painter. We know him today because of Morse code, but he was a painter, and they set up this National Academy of Design in 1825. It's been set up, but it's promoted by Morse, by Ashby Durand. And I would like you to note that this very fine building, which no longer stands in New York City, was based entirely upon buildings in Venice. And here comes in the great influence of John Ruskin, whose reach is not only in British art, but it certainly is in the art of the emerging art of North America. And so what could be better than the National Academy of Design being designed according to Ruskin's principles? Here we have it. Such a sad loss, really, not to have this in New York City now. But it was a beautiful building. We have some lovely photographs of it. And so the artists were able to exhibit here. At the same time, we were having similar buildings in Philadelphia and in Chicago and in Boston, and the great cities of the eastern part of the USA having their own academies. And this is very, very important to Americans, that it wasn't just that they weren't just artists trained in Europe and came over and painted, but they would develop their own artists, and that they would strike out in their own ways. And this became very, very important. And at the same time, there was another school emerging in USA, apart from the Hudson River School, and this is a group of artists known as the Luminists. And their concerns were very much to do, their title implies, is to do with light. But they didn't paint like Claude Monet or Renoir or Pissarro with a rough, broken brushstroke. They painted highly finished surface paintings, and such as this one here near Rhode Island, The Approaching Thunderstorm, of 1859. And this is an artist, Martin Johnson Head, who was a very, very important mid-19th century artist and one of the Luminists school. And this is a fantastic painting of an approaching thunderstorm. They also had a certain amount of shall we say, a symbolic quality to them that the French Impressionists didn't have. And they didn't have a concern with the middle class play that a lot of the French Impressionist paintings have. They were very often contemplative and have this serene quality to them, even sublime quality to them. And these are some of the artists of the Luminist school. Martin Head, he also painted in South America too. And he paints these very beautiful paintings of hummingbirds and flowers. Sanford Gifford also paints in the Catskills like Thomas Cole, but he paints in a very different style to Thomas Cole. They're full of light, but beautifully finished paintings. The paintings of Lane and of Kensett too are also important paintings, but the surfaces of these paintings are quite smooth and they're very, very highly finished works. But not very well known in Europe. But they are beautiful paintings in their own right, and they are distinctly American, one may say. Then they have departed from art of a similar period in Europe. And they often depict these grand scenes and looking at the new world and the new landscapes that they were engaging with. But over in Missouri, there was also another artist of considerable importance, detached, of course, from the artists of the Hudson River School or the Luminists. And we have another artist here of very great significance, Caleb Bingham. And he paints some of the fur trappers on the Missouri. And he is also an artist who is also a politician and has a very interesting life. If you want to seek him out on YouTube, there's a lovely films about his life. So he was a man involved in civic affairs as well as a great painter. And his paintings are full of color, full of light. And they are very strong paintings, and they often have a very, very strong human concern. They also at times talk about the relationship, maybe even the uneasy relationship between different classes within American life. So working people and people who are lording it over them. And we even have indications of some of the tensions that prefigured the American Civil War. And so he's a very interesting man too. So John Caleb Bingham. And I would say some of his paintings, although painted considerably before Huckleberry Finn and the great work of Mark Twain, they do preempt that in some way. And so if you are reading Huckleberry Finn, you can often look at a Caleb Bingham painting and it'll bring alive the world of Huckleberry Finn to mind, certainly do in my mind. And certainly the river landscapes of the Missouri are very, very well captured in Bingham's work. But we come to another artist of enormous significance and, of course, a landscape which is of dramatic importance in the psyche of all Americans, and it features in so many novels, poems, songs, and of course it is a point in a sense of pilgrimage in the USA, and that is the Great Niagara Falls. These huge horseshoe type falls capture the American imagination, and particularly as with the new railroad going out to Buffalo and with good transport services opening up upstate New York, this became a point where many artists started to paint this dramatic wonder of nature, where the great waterfalls of Niagara. And no artist captured it better than Frederick Edwin Church. He is an artist who is influenced by the Sublime, he's influenced by John Ruskin, he's influenced by Turner, but he paints it in a distinctive style, and they are very, very powerful paintings. They're huge paintings, they're immersive paintings, and we look at we think of his paintings of Niagara Falls, and you know, these things echo on in American literature and American song right up to our present times. And we think of stories of people going over the edge in barrels over the Niagara Falls. We even have this tightrope stuntman, and there are films on the internet where you can still see man contending with nature and looking at this awesome power of nature, which so entranced the artists too. And of course, like the Hudson River, Niagara Falls became this special place in the American imagination, and was painted beautifully by Church, a very significant artist. This is another one which is in the National Gallery of Scotland. A huge painting, again, including the rainbow sign, so that links it in with the Thomas Cole painting, but he is perhaps a more sophisticated painter than Thomas Cole. His technical skills are enormously sophisticated here, and one gets the sense of just the sheer power of the waterfalls here in this particular painting. And I was fortunate to photograph that last year. And of course, Church's paintings emphasize the sublime, which, as Edmund Burke in his philosophy spoke about very much. It is the noble, the splendid, or the terrifying. And these elements come out within Church's paintings. And no more so, he lives at a very significant period in of course, in American history. And he paints like some of the Luminists. He paints down in South America too. And so he paints this very, very important painting, again, almost as important as the Oxbow, this painting of Cotopaxi, which is the great volcano in Ecuador erupting. Now the painting, although Turner-esque in style, has this enormous eruption of the volcano, 1862, a very significant date, because it has been seen, it was James Lennox who commissioned this painting. It has been seen that because of the period it was painted in, that it is almost making a comment upon the coming civil war and the great turmoil within North America, and the possibility that America will be pulled apart, as indeed it was. Trouble in nature down south, in South America. It's almost saying that this is coming too. And so we have this sun emerging through the clouds, the ash clouds of the volcano, is also echoed in the clouds of war and the gun smoke that was to throw America into in the Civil War, and it's echoed in the photographs too. So the painting has taken on both a sort of prophetic power, but also a great significance for so many Americans too. This painting is an enormously important painting. And a Church, as if this is a rather obvious painting by Church, a much smaller painting is called Our Banner in the Sky. And as you can see there, the colours of the sunset form the stars and stripes. And it also echoes at this time the great patriotism, the battle hymn of the Republic. Artists were predominantly of the North, so we don't have many great artists of the Confederacy at all, and I couldn't really find any who I'd really want to talk about tonight about that, but maybe we could look into that at another time. But certainly Edwin Church brings about that in a painting. So that particular painting, Our Banner in the Sky, and the American flag becomes increasingly important in American art. And as we know, right up to the present times with the paintings of Jasper Johns and the pop artists and so many artists, it is telling the story, and it's very important in American art to have visual art which tells the story. Here we are, there's a Jasper Johns flag, a modern painting, of course, now 1954. But of course, we also have the illustrators illustrating Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag. And also at this time, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And there's a popular illustration at the time. There is Lincoln in the theatre being assassinated. And all of these parts are illustrated and painted. And we have many of these things in galleries in the USA. It's important that there are historical paintings that tell the unique story of the American history. And so these things are echoed in their paintings. Another great artist of the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th century was the great Thomas Moran, an artist who painted sublime landscapes. He painted in the Hudson River, like so many of the artists, but he moved west, but he painted this fantastic painting of Lower Manhattan in 1880, as New York was sort of rising up, not yet had any skyscrapers, but it certainly had the big brownstone buildings and the great buildings of the Greenwich Village and Lower Manhattan and the great port. And we can see almost New York itself rising up in this particular painting, New Jersey. And now Thomas Moran was a great disciple of John Ruskin, and he went and met with John Ruskin. He would write to John Ruskin. So Ruskin is a great influence upon Thomas Moran. But Moran's vision is a distinct American vision, and there he is at the end of the 19th century, painting this rainbow over the Grand Canyon. Again, it is this sign of promise, this sign of manifest destiny, almost that there is this world that has been given to, a new world that has been given to people, to the Americans upon their founding fathers' promises. Ideas which now may be challenged and may be may present difficulties because of the indigenous peoples and displacement of peoples, and of course because of slavery. But very firm in someone like Thomas Moran's mind was the idea of manifest destiny, and that comes out within his paintings. And Thomas Moran also brought out the beauty of the American West, which influenced John Muir in the Sierra Club and the National Park Service, which of course great places like Yosemite and also the great national parks of the Western USA. And we have this great idea. A book I really recommend to you is The Magisterial Gaze. And this book by Albert Bierstadt is excellent. It talks about a manifest destiny in American art and this high viewpoint, high vantage point that is unique to American art, that we're always looking out to the West, that we're looking beyond. And whether in paintings such as John Gast's painting up there of 1872, an unsophisticated, almost primitive artist, but there you see the wagon trains and the railroad trains and the great journeys out west. And we remember 20 years before, the great Californian gold rush. Didn't actually bring many artists out there at that time, but it brought many people speculating about the whole idea of moving west and the whole idea of expanding out into new territories. And of course that presented great problems because of the displacement of the indigenous peoples, but that isn't the remit of this particular talk. But it does touch how some of the paintings appeared, particularly these ones that appear in state capitol buildings, which of which there are many actually. If you go to state capitals in Nebraska, in Lincoln, Nebraska, if you go in Washington, of course, and you'll see these westward, the course of empire takes its way. By here we are, this huge painting here, illustrating the struggles of the settlers and of the wagon trains and the troubles and trials that they met. But less illustrated is of course the world of the Lakota Indians or the Sioux Indians, and Chief Sitting Bull's statement there. And if you want to play this talk back sometime, you can pause some of these statements, and so it will cause you to think that some of these paintings are now problematic in some way. But to many, they tell the story. They tell the story of this moving out west and of the American history. And of course, they celebrate the great landscape, which is, of course, so important to the indigenous peoples as it is to the settlers and to the peoples of the New World. But back in Europe, American artists were also making their mark. And I've talked many times about James Abbott McNeill Whistler and his aesthetic painting, Arts for Art's Sake, and how he took both British art by storm, but also exhibiting in Paris, and how he was a friend of artists like Edouard Manet. And Whistler was very much an artist who's had great ideas about paint should in a way be like music and have nothing to do with the classical subjects or allegories that painting had been associated with over the years. So he would have no truck with someone like Thomas Cole or Moran, in a way, who were saying grand things about landscape. Whistler's art was about beauty and about aesthetics. And we remember that he showed at the Salon des Refusés. He also was, of course, very much a part of this great Ruskin versus Whistler trial. Whistler took Ruskin to court in 1878. I've talked about this many times, but this was a great pivotal moment in art, in a way. But it took an American to challenge the great John Ruskin. And challenging, he did. He won his libel trial, but only had a farthing's damages. But of course, he brought about a whole new attitude to painting, which of course endures in American art today. So in Ruskin's, in Whistler's painting Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, we can see intimations of the boldness of 20th century art in Jackson Pollock. It's not too far away. There is something about the American can-do spirit that we see in an artist like Whistler, and also an unstuffiness about everything. And I love that statement. He said, art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone and appeal to artistic sense of eye or ear. And we have in Washington, D.C., I'd highly recommend this room, the Freer Art Gallery in Washington, D.C., this Harmony in Blue and Gold, the Peacock Room. And there we see one of Whistler's wonderful paintings and the Peacock Room and the aesthetics of that. And of course, it is about beauty and the sensual beauty of art, which was so important to Whistler. And he was so influential upon so many other artists, both in Europe and of course in North America. And of course the art of Japan was brought into it as well. And so it also brings in this international flavour, and but backwards and forwards. So Whistler, who comes from North America, trains in Europe, and then is so influential in Europe. But these expatriate artists are very important, and no more so than John Singer Sargent, whose career was basically in London and in Paris. He was born in Florence, but he is a very important American artist, and he was a great friend of Claude Monet, and in his times off, when he was not painting society portraits, was painting alongside Claude Monet at times. And he also painted near here in Gloucestershire in England, and he could paint very convincing impressionist paintings, and probably one of the most highly skilled artists who's ever lived. He was such a brilliant artist with both pencil and with paint, and there have been few like him, and he painted wonderful, beautiful paintings like the Carnation Lily Lily Rose, which can be seen at the Tate Britain in London. But he also painted these very controversial paintings too. His portrait of Madame X, which was exhibited at the Salon in 1884, was absolutely scandalous. We see the Madame X's dress now with the straps that hold her dress up, but when it was originally exhibited, there was no straps on her shoulders, and so it was a very scandalous painting. And he could paint. He painted the nude very beautifully too. That's his painting of the Egyptian Girl, which is in Chicago Art Institute, and he also was a beautiful watercolorist as well. And there's a study for Madame X. So he was an artist who could paint wonderfully. I mean, he painted well into the 20th century. He painted some wonderful paintings in the First World War. He painted the First World War generals, but he also painted the very moving painting called Gast, which is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. So he is an artist of great facility and great power, and he painted for many of the New York socialites, and particularly the Wertheimer family of New York were great patrons of John Singer Sargent, and so he was an artist who established an enormous career. I wish he had been able to paint more informal studies, but of course, being so popular, he basically couldn't keep paint. He just had to keep painting all the time to just meet demand. And one of the artists who was painting at the same time as John Singer Sargent, very much influenced by the art of Diego Velázquez, was William Merritt Chase, a wonderful painter, a beautiful painter. He paints a mixture of a sort of Velázquez type style mixed with French Impressionism. It's all bound together, but they're beautiful paintings, lots of beautiful spaces, lots of lovely color, very, very luscious paintings. Lovely to see. There's his painting of Whistler on the left there, but he paints these beautiful interiors. Again, he, like Sargent, he paints women's beauty absolutely expertly, superb with his brush, and a painter that you should seek out if you go to USA. Please look at his paintings. They're wonderful paintings. But it wasn't just men. We have one of the most important American French Impressionists, Mary Cassatt, and her paintings are lovely. They echo the paintings of Edgar Degas, but there's no better painter of the domestic scene and of motherhood and of young women than Mary Cassatt. And she is also a woman who stood up for herself very much in an age which was dominated by figures like John Singer Sargent and Merritt Chase. She said, women should be someone, not something. And it's a statement which has really resounded through American art and American paint. Again, there's an unstuffiness about America, that women were admitted to American academies, and unlike in Europe, where the path was so much more difficult for a woman to establish herself, in the USA, someone like Mary Cassatt could establish herself totally as an equal with her male counterparts. And they're beautiful paintings, Mary Cassatt. But there's another side to American art too. There's this sort of mystical side to landscape that is allied to it. And there's a wonderful painter who I'd like you to look into called George Innis. And his paintings are another form of landscape which echo the transcendentalist poetry of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Waldo Emerson's philosophy looking at nature and nature's majesty, but it's also its mystery, and that is echoed in paint in the world of George Innis's paintings, and they are remarkable paintings. They have this poetic quality, twilight quality, something mysterious going on in the woods. Homer the Heron, which one can find in the Art Institute in Chicago. They echo the paintings, the symbolist paintings of Eugene Carrière, and they have this sort of wistfulness about them, this strange sort of quality. So George Innis, a very important artist. You can see that in the late work of John Everett Millet's Dew-Drenched Firs too, influenced by the poetry of Tennyson, and certainly the poetry influenced George Innis's work. And we can look in the later work of the Hudson River painter who goes out to California, Bierstadt's painting of Among the Sierra Nevada, and you can see that quality coming into Bierstadt's late paintings there, and a wonderful painting it is too. And we have this weirdness too, this pre-Raphaelitism, but a strange mixture of pre-Raphaelitism and symbolism. And Vader's paintings, he's thought of as an American pre-Raphaelite, but in a way he's more than that. He's a symbolist, and there's this strange painting of this strange sea creature or worm on the shore painted there. He was a friend of the pre-Raphaelite painter Simeon Solomon, an interesting artist himself, and it echoes the work of Burne-Jones's Perseus series as well. So Vader, an interesting artist, and again one which we may examine next year perhaps, but interesting that pre-Raphaelitism took a different form in United States than it did in United Kingdom. And there was no more stranger painter than Albert Pinkham Ryder, whose paintings are very much a sort of akin to the world of William Blake. Strange paintings that are very encrusted with paint, unconventional materials, wax and coal tar is used on them. They've gone into ruinous state in many cases, but they are unusual paintings. They're allied very much to the novels of Washington Irving, so Washington Irving, a great novelist of the earlier part of the 19th century, but his legend of Rip Van Winkle and Ichabod Crane, all of these things come into these paintings, and very strange painting here by Quidor as well. So there is this element within American painting of these mystical paintings, and certainly Pinkham Ryder's paintings have been thought of as a really distinct voice within American art, and I think they are curious, but they also very different to anything we would find in Europe. So this one, Toilers of the Sea, you can see sort of a William Blake influence, but also you could probably see the influence of Herman Melville as well in his Moby Dick, perhaps, in the painting. And the novels of Edgar Allan Poe as well are pretty much could be echoed in a visual form in Pinkham Ryder's paintings, and particularly we know Doré from Europe, of course, illustrated Edgar Allan Poe, as did Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the pre-Raphaelite. But we have also academic artists emerging in USA. And by the late part of the 19th century in Philadelphia, we have this extraordinary artist, Thomas Eakins. And he is an artist like Sargent, a great draftsman, an absolutely brilliant painter, distinctly American, passionate to affirm an American voice in art in 19th century, independent of what's going on in Europe. And he is a very thoughtful painter. He's an artist who's influenced by photography. He's very interested in the world, in visual space. This particular painting here, Champion of the Single Skull, Schmidt in a Single Skull, 1871, is a very important painting. It shows the influence of photography, but it also shows, once again, a very distinct American style of painting. And it's a wonderful painting, has a stillness about it, has a peculiar sort of American light about it. It relishes the world, the new world of engineering in the background, the world of science. Eakins is an artist who engages with science. He also, rather like Rembrandt, is interested in the operating theatre. He paints things like that. He's interested in the human figure particularly, and he paints it with great care and precision. And so he's interested in painting from the nude, and he does these wonderful paintings. There's a swimming hole painting there. He does a number like that. He also uses photography in a very interesting way. And I put this comment by Sir Kenneth Clarke up here because I like this. It says only bad artists of the 19th century were frightened by the invention of photography. The good ones all welcomed it and used it. And that's very true, because it is certainly true that Eakins used photography in a very, very intelligent way, as had someone like Léon Trérôme in France. And so Eakins is a very, very important artist, and one day I'd love to give a talk on him. But his paintings are different. They're not painterly like Singer Sargent's paintings. They're far more precise, and they have this also this great thoughtfulness about them, but they are distinctly American, I would say. They're different from European art of any type. I can't think of a European counterpart to Eakins. And another great artist who I just couldn't talk about 19th century American art without mentioning the great Winslow Homer, who started his career as an illustrator of Harper's Weekly. He emerges from the period of the Civil War, so we may also see his paintings very much as allegories. And so when he has a veteran in a new field, 1865, he's not just painting like a Jean-Francois Millet of the sower or the reaper. He is also alluding to the great Civil War, and obviously the death that had taken place of so many of his fellow countrymen during the Civil War, and now the new reconciliation and healing that was to be brought about. And so his great themes in art are very often using landscape once again, but also using these figurative subjects. And so Veteran in a New Field is a very, very important post-Civil War painting. And they are wonderfully painted too. Winslow Homer was a great draftsman. He did work some of the time in Ireland as well, so he'd been over to the old world as well, so he was well acquainted with British art and Irish art and art of France. But he brings again a distinct American voice, and he is able to come back, and his paintings adorn so many American art galleries. And so his version of really an American raft of the Medusa is so interesting. This one, called The Gulf Stream, depicts a black man upon a boat surrounded by sharks with the broken mast of the ship adrift in the waters, echoing the very much earlier American painting by Singleton Copley, Watson and the Shark. It echoes that painting, it echoes the raft of the Medusa, but this is a modern painting. This is a painting about the problematic world, post-slavery world of the black man in America. And of course, Winslow Homer is engaging with that. It's still shark-infested waters. And Winslow Homer paints the sea like no other artist. You could almost say he's almost like an American Turner. He paints the sea and its churning quality in a very emotional way. And his work, he himself, a sailor, goes down to the Caribbean regularly, and his watercolors are wonderful. But this painting, The Gulf Stream, is a wonderful painting, and is just full of symbolic significance. And he did eventually paint the little ship that was coming to rescue the man in the background, rather like in the art raft of the Medusa too. So he's echoing the history of art, the history of the old world, but this is a very much a distinctive new world painting and about new world problems. The art of the French Impressionists left a profound effect upon American art, and this artist, Charles Hassam, paints these wonderful parades and these beautiful paintings with flags going down places like Fifth Avenue are some of his great paintings, but he's very much a modern artist, and he places the American flag, the stars and stripes are very much a part of his paintings. And here's one of his paintings. And he also paints the sea similarly in a beautiful way, but much more in a style like Claude Monet or a post-impressionist artist than indeed Winslow Homer. So he's an interesting artist, Charles Hassam, very important artist in the development of American Impressionism. And another artist who was also a post-impressionist, Maurice Prendergrass, and he paints in this post-impressionist style, often paints in places like the Gardens in Boston and New York. They have a very strong style. They are allied to the work of Pierre Bonnard, the French Nabi painter, the illustrator, who we can see there. I put a couple of examples of that work. But Prendergast's paintings are distinct too. They show high society or within the parks of America at the turn of the century. So a lovely painter, well worth looking out, and again, an original painter too. And Winslow Homer returns to the Hudson River, where my story began this evening, 1892. There he is painting on Hudson, one of his superb watercolors. He's a great painter, is Winslow Homer, and as good with watercolor as he is with oil color, and they're lovely, lovely works. And so we move into the 20th century, and we're just going to slightly move into the 20th century, slightly out of the age of Victoria, because I wanted to just show you how this distinct voice of American art really came to fruition. And we have the paintings of George Bellows and the Ashcan School developing in New York, and of course we have the building of the new metropolis, the new skyscrapers which were coming, the Woolworth Building, Lower Manhattan, a great new city which was emerging, and all the European immigrants arriving. And so there's John Sloan of the Ashcan School, a pupil of Robert Henry. Robert Henry is an artist influenced by the old world, but he comes up with this new type of painting. And the Ashcan School were not interested in the socialites, but they were interested in the world of the Bowery, the world of Manhattan, the bars, the markets, and the docks. And they echo the paintings of Luke Fildes in England, but they are a distinct American voice. And so the world of George Lux and of Robert Henry, they're interested in the new emerging railway stations of Grand Central and Madison Square Garden, where the great railway stations are being built. And they paint these things. And Henry wanted to be almost a journalist of paint, and is an interesting artist. So this emerges from all of the paintings that I've shown you this evening, and we have really the greatest artist to come out of the Ashcan School from the John Sloan was George Bellows, and we're very fortunate in England now to actually have a George Bellows in the National Gallery, and it shows this world from the and now if you notice in this George Bellows painting in the middle, the viewpoint has changed. We no longer look at the America from a high vantage point of the hill, looking out west or looking across a landscape that is to be conquered. We're looking at regular people, looking at the great ships that are arriving in New York. And so very often now the viewpoint is from the common man's position. And this is an interesting thing. And George Bellows is a great artist. He also was a great painter of the great illegal boxing clubs of New York of the early years of the century. So a great painter, one who is worth a whole talk on by himself. And he was also illustrated for this socialist magazine called The Masses, which is outside of our period of concern, but it's interesting to see how art has really moved on from a romantic period through to this distinct voice of American art, moving into our own time. And it concludes in 1913 with the Armory show in New York, where the new modern art from Europe is brought as a result of the artists from the Ashcan School. They invite the new modern artists of Europe to come and exhibit in New York City, much to the bewilderment of artists like John Sloan, who see the first Cubist paintings of Picasso and the new Descending Staircase by Marcel Duchamp. But it sets America on a new course, and in fact supplants New York, eventually becomes the head of the art world, and the baton is exchanged between Paris and to New York. So we see American art and the seeds of it develop throughout the late 19th century and until this unique voice that has been so important in the 20th century in visual art, and obviously is outside of our period of discussion. But I hope I've taken you on a journey tonight which introduces you to a few names and a few schools of art. So don't hurry through when you're going through through museums. These paintings are important paintings, and they may help us to understand, us Europeans, to understand a little bit more about American character and the American approach to landscape, and particularly.